Hey everybody, and welcome to the next edition of the Soccer Fitness Goals video blog. This week, the Canadian soccer community got some disappointing news, and that is that our men's national under-17 team that was just beginning the qualification process for the upcoming FIFA Men's Under-17 World Cup. We lost both of our first two qualification matches, the first one to Costa Rica and the second one to Cuba on Wednesday by a score of 2-1. And as a result of those two losses, unfortunately, we have failed to qualify for the upcoming Men's Under-17 World Cup. And as I said, that is disappointing news, but to me, it hasn't been as disappointing as something else that's going to be the topic of the video blog for this week, and that is the reaction by many different soccer players, soccer parents, soccer coaches, and other soccer people that I've seen on different websites and various different social media outlets following these disappointing losses. So why was I so disappointed with the response on social media from the Canadian soccer community following our men's under-17 national team failing to qualify for the upcoming World Cup? Well, the problem is that although many of the responses were rightfully critical of our national team program, of the way that we identify players and the system in general, and as I said, we're right, all of us, including me, I'm critical too. We're right to be critical of these things. The problem is that the criticism too often is vague and involves the use of jargon. So what I'll do is I'll start just by quickly defining these terms, and then I'll give some specific examples of some of the comments and criticism that I saw online that I think just perfectly fall into these categories. So first of all, vague is sort of another word for indefinite or uncertain. And jargon is defined as, and I'll give you the exact Wikipedia definition for that word. Jargon is special words or expressions that are used by a particular profession or group and are difficult for others to understand. So, as I said, a lot of the criticism that's been directed towards the Canadian soccer system is vague and it involves the use of jargon, and I'm not a big fan of this type of language. I mentioned that in one of my previous video blogs when I discussed charlatans like mindset coaches and nutritionists who use jargon and pseudoscience in order to try to position themselves as experts and speak about things for which they actually do not have any expertise. So the same kind of thing happens when soccer people make criticisms that are vague and that involve too much jargon or the use of words and phrases that people don't understand. Just a couple of just general examples. If you're thinking about soccer, if you wanted to be vague and use jargon to criticize the Canadian soccer system, you might say something along the lines of, there's too much politics in Canadian soccer. Or another common thing that you might say or you might see people say is, we need a better system for player identification. So those are broad, general, vague, sweeping statements, and there's some jargon in there, politics, for example, or system of player identification. They're not specific. They don't really give the listener or the reader any specific information about what you mean. And if our criticism of the Canadian soccer system is going to be limited to that type of language, we are never going to get better. Now I'm going to mention just a couple of examples that are taken from the many comments and criticisms that I've seen online in the last few days following our under-17 team not qualifying for the World Cup. And I'm not going to put any names beside these comments, and I'm not doing this at all with the intention of calling anyone out, because as I said, I am critical when we don't do well, and I think other people are right to be critical. But the problem is the nature of the criticism, and specifically the lack of specificity the vagueness and also the use of jargon or other words that don't really have any meaning. As an example, when we say things online such as Canada soccer needs a more professional structure, well, again, that's vague. There's nothing specific that comes out of that statement or criticism, and so it isn't really a way to lead us forward. It's just sort of a complaint. The same kind of thing would happen when you would see people saying things like Canada soccer is a joke, coaches don't know what they're doing, players aren't good enough, etc. So whether those things are right or wrong, they're criticisms, but they're vague criticisms. They're too broad, they're too much done in a generalizing tone, and there's no specific outcome that's going to come out of that type of criticism. So what's the solution or the alternative to this type of criticism? For me, the solution is to be specific in criticism and to make suggestions based on objective evidence. And what I mean by that is look at what other people in other parts of the world are doing that has objectively been shown to work and to be successful, and direct the comments, criticism, and suggestions towards that empirical evidence. For example, I recently wrote and published a blog discussing my suggestions for ways that youth soccer coaches can objectively assess players' performance in training and games, and also to objectively identify who the most talented players are in different leagues. And again, these are my suggestions, but they're not just based on my subjective opinion, and they're not vague. They're suggestions that are based on empirical evidence, meaning some of the work that I've done in other countries and the traveling that I've done observing what's being done in other countries with scouting, player identification, and monitoring and tracking performance, and trying to suggest a model or a system of objective player assessment that I think will work in our own Canadian system. Now, this is just one example from me, but there's hundreds or thousands of ways that we can do this with our criticism. And what that does is that forces us, all of us in the soccer community, to be more constructive and open-minded in our criticism. So rather than just throwing out insults or throwing out vague criticisms that involve the use of jargon, if you try to come up with a solution, so a criticism that then leads to some constructive solution, then that's a way forward for us. And so that's really the only thing that I wanted to talk about in the blog today, is that as Canadian soccer people, whether that's coaches, fitness coaches, parents, players, administrators, we have a right to be upset and to be critical of the Canadian soccer system, including the coaching in the national teams, the player selections, the way that the national teams are run, how often they train, what type of training they do, the training camps, the exhibition games, all of it. And even the youth system that leads up to the players being identified into the national teams. It's fine to be critical of those things, but the criticism should not be vague, should not involve the use of jargon, and it should be constructive with specific criticism and also with specific suggested outcomes or solutions. So I did mention the article that I wrote in my blog last week, and what we'll do is we'll put up the link here if you'd like to have a look at that, just as an example of what I believe is a little bit more constructive criticism of the soccer system here in Canada. And that's it for the Soccer Fitness Goals video blog for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you're looking for a soccer-specific, customized home training program, you can click this link to download the Soccer Fitness Goals mobile fitness app. We'll see you next week, and until then, keep reaching your soccer fitness goals.